When I think of scattered terrain, the first thing I typically think of is rocks. But I already made those, so I had to go back to the drawing board. Boxes. And these aren't just any boxes, oh no. Today, we're making wooden crates. I am somewhat of a modular terrain supporter. I stand by my magnetic dungeon tiles because they are so useful and take up so little space and storage. However, the one big problem I tend to have with my terrain is it is very flat and boring. Which can work if I'm planning to run every combat in just a plain, open field. And hey, if that's what you're into, more power to you. I, on the other hand, am wanting a bit more from my combat. And that's where scattered terrain comes in. Just look how adding a few pieces of scattered terrain changed the entire scenery, causing it to be a lot more three-dimensional. But that's enough about that. Let's get into the actual craft itself. We are going to start with 1-inch thick XPS foam. This is a very popular material for crafting terrain, and you can find it online or at a local hardware store. But this craft requires very little foam, so I'm actually just using a random offcut that I had from a previous project. Next, you're going to cut down the foam into 1-inch by 1-inch cubes. Here I'm just using my old crates to measure. I couldn't find my ruler at the time and I was being extra lazy. For cutting, I'm using a table hot wire cutter, the Proxxon, but you don't need to be extremely precise with these cuts. You could probably also use a hand hot wire cutter if you don't want to drop $100 on buying a Proxxon. I probably wouldn't recommend using a knife here because you most likely won't get a clean cut trying to cut through that 1-inch thick foam. And while I'm only making one crate in this video, it's a lot better to try to do it in a full batch. Your next step is going to be taking an Exacto knife, and you are essentially cutting out 2 parallel lines at the ends of each square. At the ends of each square, at the end of each face of the cube. Yeah, that's right. And I'm going to be showing a lot of cuts on the screen, and rather than trying to explain it all, I'm going to be instead just going to pop up a diagram about how you're going to cut. I have not made that diagram while recording the voice yet, so I'm just going to be thinking that the diagram's up on screen now. What a lovely sight. So the first step in your cutting is you're essentially making a tiny square on each face. The main things that are going to be different from the faces will be the top and the bottom of the cube are going to be ever so slightly different than the sides. What you are doing right now with your Exacto knife is you are carving out the individual wooden planks, and you will see it come together a lot better in the later steps. And here I'm just showing off the first step with the squares. Your next step is going to be to carve out a diagonal wooden plank across the face of the inside square. I prefer all of these diagonals to be in the same direction. I guess it doesn't really matter if they're in the same direction or not, but if one being slightly off bothers you, I would recommend keeping in mind to make them all go in the same direction. Next, you're going to add the inside wood planks that are going to be parallel to the long end of the outside planks. Saying that description out loud, it does not make much sense, but I hope the video does a better job of explaining it than I do. Your next step will be to take a toothpick and widen all those gaps that you cut with your Exacto knife. You could also use a ballpoint pen, but I feel as though the ballpoint pen is a little bit too big for the scale that we're doing. Next, what you're going to do is add 2 holes at the end of each plank to look like nails are holding this crate together. It was a bit touch and go there for a second, but now it's actually finally starting to look like a crate. Our next step is going to be to add texture, and we're going to do this with both our Exacto knife and our toothpick. With our Exacto knife, we're going to be scoring in the direction of each plank, adding some deeper cuts and some just lighter scratches. And you can mix it up a little bit and not go in the same direction the entire time, but I would be careful about doing this too much. Next, we're going to take our toothpick and we're going to do essentially the same process that we did with our Exacto knife. Denting the foam with long strokes so it actually starts to look like wooden planks. And now we finally have our seafoam green wooden crate. But you say, what if I don't want that seafoam green wooden crate? Well, lucky for you, there's more to this video than that. Before we can add any paint onto our terrain, it's always a good idea to give a nice layer of Mod Podge. When you are applying this Mod Podge layer, try not to glob it on too thick just because you don't want to clog up any of the details too much. And this is where it really pays to be working on multiple crates at once, because when I was just working on this one, I had to let this crate sit for about 30 minutes before I could go back and do the other side. And before I forget to mention, something that tends to happen with these crates is because it has so many little indentions and cuts that the Mod Podge doesn't necessarily get everywhere. And so that kind of leaves pieces of the original foam showing. And if you don't want that original pink or green showing through when you're finished with your terrain, I would recommend, before actually doing your painting, is taking some watered down black paint and applying it heavily across your entire model. This will seep into all those cracks and take away that original color. And now for the paint. Every time I paint something, whether it be miniatures or terrain, I always recommend doing 3 different layers: a base tone, a mid-tone, and a highlight. The paints that we are using are just going to be brown and a tan or a khaki color. For our base tone, we're going to use just the brown with For our base tone, we're going to use the brown with nothing else mixed in. This layer you want to apply fairly thick, but you don't necessarily want to go into all of the cracks. Next up, for our mid-tone, we're going to use about half and half brown and khaki. And here we are just applying it fairly lightly, getting off most of the paint before you actually apply it. You don't want to be globbing it on or laying it on thick like you did with the brown. Here we're just kind of mainly hitting all of the very raised areas. And you can see that the brown is still showing underneath while I'm applying this layer. And for our highlights, we're just going to use that khaki color, and we are going to do a dry brush over this, making sure all the excess paint is off before actually doing this layer. I would also try to hit the edges in the corner with your highlights so that while the crates are on the table, it pops a lot more. And finally, here is our finished singular crate. Comparing it back to the crates I made long before this video, there were several problems that I ended up solving when creating this new one. And I just picked a random stack from my old crates, and you can see that there are plenty of gaps where the original foam is showing that I didn't consider when doing the final painting. And in order to get rid of that, like the genius I am, I tried to use shade paint from Games Workshop. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially watered down paint that flows into cracks and crevices very easily. Did not really help my problem at all, and you may notice if you look very carefully, and it's a little bit hard to see, so I don't blame you if you don't see it on your first try, that some of the crates appear to be a smidge shiny. So if you run into the same problem like I did, I would stray away from shade paints like that. So now I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to rate this craft so that you can see whether or not you would like to build it yourself. The 4 categories I'm going to rate it out of are going to be cost/materials, time, difficulty, and aesthetics. In terms of cost and materials, I'm going to give this terrain 4 crates out of 5. because while if you're already making terrain, the cost of this piece is essentially free, if you have to buy all of the materials from scratch, it can start to add up a little bit. Thankfully though, it works in the reverse way, where if you're planning on making more terrain in the future, all of the stuff that you're getting will be very helpful later on. In terms of time, I think this terrain earns 3 crates out of 5. While it isn't the quickest piece of terrain that I've made, I've certainly spent a whole lot longer on other pieces. The actual carving of the texture and the details takes a large chunk of the time, and then waiting around for the various different layers to dry when you're applying the Mod Podge and the paint. Thankfully, during the painting section, you can typically just go and do something else while you're waiting for it to dry. For aesthetics, I think that this piece gets 4 crates out of 5. When you're actually looking at these crates up close and personal, you can start to notice the inconsistencies and imperfections. But whenever you're actually using these on the table, I think that these crates do a wonderful job and look amazing. And for difficulty, I think that this piece of terrain earns a 4 out of 5. As long as you have all the tools and materials, these crates are super easy to make. The only thing that I think that holds it back from being a 5 out of 5 is the fact that you have to be a little patient when making these, especially during your texturing stages. You can't be completely mindless when making these, but as long as you're following the steps, you shouldn't have any problems. After totaling it all up, this craft earns a 15 out of 20 crates. A must build in my opinion if you're lacking some scatter terrain. I have more easy terrain crafts on my channel, so check those out if you're interested. I am also in the makings of a web series on how to create a D&D world and campaign from scratch. Please like, subscribe, and comment if there's any terrain that you would like to see made. Alright, bye for now.